So hello, I am Chuck Proudfit. I am an import from Cincinnati down here to you guys at Asbury. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm really having a good time just getting to know all of you a little bit. I wanted to take just a few minutes as we open up to go around. If you could give me your name and what you're doing at the university or the seminary, like if you're a student, what you're studying, or if you're on faculty or whatever. Let's see. Why don't we start there and we'll just work our way around.
My name's Rachel. I'm a business and Spanish student at Asbury University.
Good.
My name's Shane, and I'm also a business major at Asbury University.
Okay.
My name's Austin. I'm a business major and a communication minor at the university.
Awesome.
My name's Alex. I'm an accounting major at the university.
Okay.
I'm Haley, and I'm a business administration major at the university.
Wow, there's a theme going on here.
I'm Jared. I'm a business and sports management major at the university as well.
Okay.
I'm Gustavo. I'm a business major at Asbury.
All right.
I'm Alejandra, and I am a business major at Asbury.
Okay.
I'm Norma Miller. I'm an ATS alumni from 2010, and currently still lives here in the community. So I'll break the
That's awesome. All right, so of those of you here, how many of you were at the chapel this morning where I spoke? Okay, good, so about half of you. I want to do two things in the hour that we've got. We'll spend about 40 minutes where I'm talking and then about 20 minutes where we can ask questions and have some dialogue back and forth, all right? The focal point that I had for this morning was to say, if we're combining a head for business with a heart for ministry, if we are a Christian gifted with entrepreneurship, if we would like to start an enterprise from scratch that was faith-based, that was a business-tree, what would it look like compared to a regular business? And this morning I was talking about 5 things that set apart a business tree from just a standard run-of-the-mill business. I had given them in the context of a definition, and let me launch out today with that definition. A business tree is a self-sustaining enterprise that is 1, dedicated to God, 2, commissioned for a kingdom purpose, 3, operating with biblical principles, 4, integrating ministry throughout its operations, and 5, releasing a sustained flow of funds for further ministry advancement. Those 5 things. And I had shared that those 5 areas of focus come out of some research that I did in leadership for the At Work on Purpose ministry. So this is a ministry to everyday working Christians with the objective that a Christian would bring faith to everyday work, with the knowledge that 95% of the time working Christians don't do that. The vast majority of us go to church on Sunday and work on Monday. Only about 5% actively integrate faith and work. So we've got a lot of work to do there. And as I was researching everyday working Christians to understand what do we struggle with at work, spiritually speaking, and what are the solutions that come around those, we found that there were 5 overarching spiritual struggles. And those 5 struggles have solutions which frame those 5 areas that we just talked about for a business tree. So this guy here, everybody should have a copy of this. Do you have this guy? Okay, we need to get you one. Let's see, and you don't either. Okay. There's one set right there. Let's get you one more. When you're in business, you always do the business cards, unless, of course, you're a millennial and then it's all digital. But I'm not. I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm like part digital and part old-fashioned paper. All right, is there anybody else who doesn't have stuff? We're all good? Okay. So if you open this guy up, this is basically a quick summary of that research, right? The panel on the left says it's experiential. What do we experience as a Christian when we go to work? Well, the first struggle that we experience is the struggle of sacred versus secular. Will we view work as one aspect of an integrated life of faith or a separate space where God is not present? Spiritually speaking, although we struggle with this a lot at work, we are to choose sacred over secular. To a Christian, there is no secular. Anything in life that isn't sinful is sacred, and work is a form of worship. What that means, in other words, is that our solution here is to accept the premise that work that we could do, including work entrepreneurially, is for the Lord. This is the first part of a BIZNISTRY definition, that a BIZNISTRY is dedicated to God. That we understand that we are Christians called to leadership of a new venture, but it is dedicated to the Lord's work and to the advancement of God's kingdom in and through the marketplace. The second struggle is calling versus career. Will we pursue the vocation for which God created us, or settle for the career that the world tells us is better? And as I mentioned this morning, the root word for vocation is vocare. It's Latin. It means a call of God for our work. That idea has been lost in modern society. Typically, if you look at a thesaurus, you'll see vocation is interchanged with career or job. But the spirit of vocation is to do the work for which God created us. So if that's the case, and we do struggle with that, we need to choose calling over career. We need to know that we'll have many different jobs over a career lifetime, but we're always called to serve others to God's glory wherever we're assigned, wherever we're deployed at work, including as an entrepreneur if we're launching a new venture. We need to identify God's purpose for our work. Sometimes it may be just an internship, or maybe it's an entry-level job that isn't what we're looking for long-term, but there's ministry in it. If God has us there in the moment, then He's called us to be the church where we're working right there in that moment. For an entrepreneur who's starting up a new venture, this is the part where it's organizationally commissioning the enterprise to have an impact for the kingdom in the marketplace. So we start out with dedicated to God, and now we have commission for a kingdom purpose. In other words, when we launch this enterprise, it isn't just launching the BIZNISTRY so that it can make $1, but so that it can make a difference. What does it look like for that BIZNISTRY to have a clear purpose that's improving quality of life, that is bringing prosperity to the city, that is addressing felt needs and solving intractable problems in our society? That the BIZNISTRY would be commissioned for more than just making money. The money should follow from the mission. The third struggle here is the struggle of righteousness versus compromise. Will we uphold God's standards of conduct at work, or succumb to the standards of the work world? And the work world is filled with a lot of compromise. Every time you go onto the internet and you check out the latest news stories and you see whatever the current scandal is, like right now in Hollywood with Harvey Weinstein and all the stuff around, sexual promiscuity and rape and suggestive behavior and harassment, and it just goes on and on. And that's just this week. Next week there'll be something new. It's just constant. But the solution here, whether we're an individual working Christian or at the organizational level, is to operate according to biblical principles. In God's Word, we find a lot of clear guidance for how we should behave. So if we're trying to figure out what kind of work is best for us, we need to ask our peers to give feedback to us. Why? Because the truth will set us free. We may not always see or be self-aware in and of ourselves where we tend to perform best or fit best, but people may give us feedback that would really help us if we were willing to listen. The truth will set you free. Or the borrower is a slave to the lender. Or let your yes be a yes and your no be a no. Or. There are so many biblical principles, but so rarely are they applied to the way we do business. So the opportunity here is to harness those biblical principles for the operation of the business. And if you're the entrepreneur who starts it, you're the person who's going to bring those into the operations of the BIZNISTRY. So it's simply following the principles that we learn to understand and contextualize in the business operation that we have right in front of us. This fourth area of struggle is growth versus stagnation. Will we view work as a critical arena for spiritual formation or just a place to get a paycheck? You see, most working Christians just see work as a place to go and make money to support yourself. You know, like I owe, it's off to work I go. But when we get up on Monday morning, we don't say, man, I get to go to work today. The vast majority of us say what? I have to go to work today. In other words, what's driving us isn't the intrinsic motivation for work, it's more the external motivation that we have obligations and responsibilities. But the idea here is to understand that when we're at work on purpose, if we have an entrepreneurial venture that we've launched, there are so many ministry opportunities in front of us. The average local church has a congregation size of under 100 people, according to George Barna, about 85 people. The average working Christian has a sphere of influence of about 250 people, 3 times the size of the average local church. If we can start to see ourselves as ministering in the day-to-day marketplace, as being on mission in the marketplace, that the people around us at work are the mission field that we have for spiritual development, that's a huge insight. And when you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a BIZNISTRY, you have a whole bunch of stakeholder groups. They're all people groups that are involved with the business operations, and you can serve all of them in unique ways. We're going to come back to that thought later. So if the struggle is improvement versus stagnation, the solution is to develop people professionally and personally in and through our everyday work. And we can absolutely do that as a BIZNISTRY entrepreneur, just like you would if you're an employee in an everyday job. Then the last struggle here is the struggle of stewardship versus ownership. Will we view the resources of the work world as belonging to God for His purposes or belonging to us for ours? It's so common in the marketplace. When you start up an enterprise, people will say, wow, now you're a business owner. There's a biblical problem with that phrase. Because biblically speaking, we don't own anything. The Bible tells us that everything under the sun belongs to God, that the cattle on 1,000 hills are His. We aren't owners, we are stewards of the resources that God entrusts to us. If we start an entrepreneurial venture, we are called to steward it to God's glory. So we're not business owners, we're really business stewards. And what that means is, this is the solution. We need to recognize the resources that God has given us in the marketplace, and how can we take that prosperity and harness it for the common good of the communities where we work and where we live. That you're not just in business to make money so you become profitable, but you make money to be purposeful. And you don't just take the dollars, right, the financial resources, but what about the facilities that are at your disposal, the equipment, the talented people? What does it look like to open up the space that you're renting so that other ministries can use it as well as your business operation? What does it look like if you've got some equipment that could be really useful outside of the 4 walls of your office space, out in the community? What if you are able to take the resources that you have and provide job training so that eventually other people can find meaningful work? These are all ways that we can take the resources from an entrepreneurial venture and harness them for the community around us. So if the struggle is stewardship versus ownership, the solution is to extend prosperity from a working world to a hurting world. And in the marketplace, we've got a lot of prosperity that we can be stewarding for the common good. So we have this frame of reference. And then you see over here where it says it's biblical. This is essentially the biblical scripture that attaches to all 5 of these struggles and solutions. And it summarizes in simple terms what it looks like for us to have the profile of a faith-active working Christian. That we choose sacred over secular, calling over career, righteousness over compromise, growth over stagnation, stewardship over ownership. And all of those things can happen with an entrepreneurial venture, not just with an individual in a job. That's what this summarizes. And then on the back, I won't take a lot of time to unpack all this, but I just want you guys to have this for reference going forward, because it's kind of a handy cheat sheet, if you will, right? Just to go through one to illustrate. Let's say that you're somebody who's trying to figure out, so many of you are students at the university right now. You're going to be graduating, and you're going to be figuring out where you want to go work, right? So you apply for different jobs, you're debating, should I be in accounting, or should I be in general management, or what does all that look like? Well, that's a really important decision. It's just the first of a bunch that you're going to make as you explore different jobs and maybe different careers and industries over the course of decades. But you're starting right now. Now, most people just put their resumes out and they wait to see who interviews them. And then from the interviews, who ends up giving them an offer. And then from the offers, you just say, okay, this looks like the best choice of the three. It looks like I'd have the most fun here, so that's my choice. That's the way the world typically picks a job. But if you look over here on this back panel where it says it's methodological, under the part for identify purpose at work, here's what most working Christians don't do. We don't ask for God's guidance on the front end. We pray for a lot of stuff in our lives, but I am stunned at how infrequently Christians pray around their work. It's like, God, what are you calling me to do in this season of my work life? What kind of employment do you have for me? If you prepared good works in advance for me to do, where do I start with those? To ask. To literally ask God to help you see through His eyes. Then the second one, to discern God's will. Now, I know that sounds obvious, but it's especially true once you get out into the working world. Most of us are so busy every day. We're running around like headless chickens getting through the workday. We don't take the time to hear what God's telling us. We don't wait for the still small voice that could be giving us the answer that we so desperately want. And then it gets even harder, because step 2 is discerning, but then step 3 is submitting. How do we submit to God's will if the answer that we hear back is that He's calling us to the job that maybe wasn't our personal first pick? And now we're wrestling with, this is what I wanted to do versus this is what God's calling me to do. And if you haven't had that experience yet, I guarantee you at some point in your work life, you're going to feel that tension between a choice that would feel easier and a choice that just feels more spiritually grounded, that's more what God's looking for you to do. Well, my point is this set of steps, this process, this methodology, this is just as true for an enterprise at the organizational level as it is for an individual, right, at the personal level. So, God, I have gifting as an entrepreneur. I have this idea, but what are you calling me to do with it in the marketplace? And then to listen so you can understand what He's saying, and then to be willing to follow that direction. That's essentially what this is. My encouragement to you guys is simply to have this frame of reference for BIZNISTRY as you get started. Now, the other takeaway sheet that I gave you guys is this one here that's called Return on Involvement. Everybody's got this one? Yes? Okay. So, in Luke chapter 10, Jesus is sending out the 70 disciples in work teams of 2 to go to surrounding towns and villages and share the good news of Christ. And I am paraphrasing. I sometimes call this the New International Chuck version. As you go to these surrounding towns and villages, if they blow you off, then dust off your sandals and move on. But if they're nice to you, then get to know them, hang out with them, eat with them, build friendships with them, find out what their felt needs are, and provide solutions for those problems. Then, when the day comes that they ask you why you cared enough to go the extra mile for them, you are now given the chance to explain that Jesus is the motivation behind the way that you've helped. In other words, in this scripture in Luke chapter 10, Jesus is laying out a prescriptive process, 4 specific steps for engaging people where we work, to bless the people around us at work, to fellowship with them as we build relationships, to minister to their felt needs, and then to proclaim Christ as the reason for our motivation. I would suggest to you that if we're really doing our work as the church at work, there will come a day where you're going to lead somebody to Christ through your work. And when that day comes, you have the opportunity to be one of the folks discipling them, not just leading them to the Lord and sending them to a local church, but you could literally be the church where they work. You could be one of those people who raises them up spiritually using work as the venue, as the backdrop for that spiritual development. So you'll notice then on this sheet, which looks kind of like a spreadsheet, right? The rows are those things I just mentioned. Bless, fellowship, minister, proclaim, disciple. There's a book that some of you might enjoy reading called Prayer Evangelism by Ed Silvoso, which unpacks this process in more detail. But imagine for just a minute if you took these columns and you imagined that these were the stakeholder groups for a BIZNISTRY enterprise that you're launching. You see, if you're launching an enterprise, you guys know this if you're taking classes at the university on the business side of things. If you're starting an enterprise, you're going to have customers and employees and contractors and suppliers and regulators and investors and competitors, right? And imagine for a moment that all of those people groups are the columns on this sheet. And now imagine for a minute that you're filling this out strategically as a way to minister to the people around you in the business enterprise. So for example, it can beg some tough questions. This first row here is bless. How do you bless a competitor? How do you proclaim Christ to a supplier that you'll never meet in person? How do you fellowship with somebody who has a really antisocial personality and they're just hard to spend time with? And yet they're one of the people that you're supposed to be caring for spiritually because they're in your sphere of influence. This exercise demands a lot of strategic thinking, but it is a great way to have systematic ministry in the operation of a BIZNISTRY. In fact, for the BIZNISTRYs that we operate, this is one of the tools that we use to create our ministry impact plan. It's not just a business plan, right, where you figure out how you develop strategies and tactics that build your total market share, build your revenue, build your profitability. You see, this stuff is never going to make traditional financial statements. It's not going to be on a profit and loss statement. It's not going to be on a cash flow statement. It's not going to be on a balance sheet. That's why it's not called return on investment, although it says ROI. It's called return on involvement. As we involve ourselves in the lives of the people around us at work, we are harvesting over time, spiritually, a bunch of fruit. But it's God's kind of fruit. It's an eternal fruit. It's not the kind of stuff that the world would measure, and in most cases, the world would not care about. My partner in crime for this stuff, Pastor Jeff Greer, he and I do a lot of this BIZNISTRY stuff together. He likes to call this the stree in BIZNISTRY. It's the intentional ministry that's woven into the tapestry of your day-to-day business operations. And the reason that I wanted to spend some time helping you to see this part is because for the vast majority of entrepreneurs, it doesn't matter if you're Christian or not. When you work hard to start up an entrepreneurial venture, you typically spend the first few years just struggling to survive. It is not easy. The marketplace is brutal. You're often underfunded from a financial capital standpoint. You have established competitors, whereas you're an upstart. If you have employees, they're new to the game, and you've got to figure out how to motivate them, how to get them productive. You've got cash flow pressure. How do you make sure you've got enough money on hand to keep the doors open while you're still working towards profitability? There's so much that presses on us just to get the business side up and running, that the ministry side feels like a luxury. The easy answer is to say, once we finally get this operation profitable, then we could look at some ministry in it. And what I'm telling you is that the harder path is to say, if this is a businessry, how are we integrating this ministry dimension into our operations from the beginning and across all the stakeholder groups? It's the ministry part of the businessry that gets short shrifted the most. So let me pause here. I'm wondering if any of you, as I've been talking, have just preliminary thoughts or questions from what I've shared. Wow. When it's this quiet, I think to myself, either everybody is out to lunch or the post-lunch doldrums, or I've said things so profound that I've left you speechless. Yeah.
What are some creative ways that you've sought to pour into some of these more eclectic groups that you had mentioned, such as suppliers that you may rarely see, and or even ways to bless clientele or customers in ways that are sometimes unorthodox or not typically thought of?
Yeah. Well, let's take the supplier example. There are a couple things that come to mind that I've seen over the years. One of them is, you know how you may order stuff online and you never talk to like a live person, but you may actually take the extra time to connect where you're doing a transaction, right? You're buying something, but you find out what it looks like to send an email to the organization and say, hey, just placed an order, but I just had some customer feedback. I was wondering if I could share. And then it's amazing how they'll get back to you. They're thinking, oh, something went wrong, what's going on? But then you can basically say, hey, I just wanted you to know I've been a customer for 3 years. I've really appreciated the response that you've had. It's just been a surprise to me because it's a very automated environment, but it's clear that there's some people back there who care about me as a customer, and I just wanted to call and tell you that in person. By the way, what is your name? See what I'm saying? It's a way where you actually go around the technology to find the person or to find a person who's inside that organizational environment. Here's another one. I've got a client who every year he finds something thematic that speaks to the birth of Christ, you know, the Christmas story. Sometimes he may have seen something. He was on a trip or a vacation and he saw a picture or a story. And what he'll do, he will personally write about it in a postcard format, and he'll typically have a description of it and this experience that he had and what it means for him in the context of Jesus' birth during this time of Christmas, and he'll have some sort of a visual image. If he doesn't have a photo, he'll have like a graphic artist do it up to make it pretty and stuff like that. But what he'll always do is basically the climactic finishes within this Christmas season. I am so grateful for the Christ that I know who's behind Christmas, and I'm sharing that with you in the hopes that it can be true for your life as well. I mean, it's basically evangelism in the form of a postcard, right? But he hand produces these. They're very personal. And then he distributes them to all of the people in his sphere of influence. So they go out to the customers, the employees, the suppliers. This is another creative way where you just look for a moment where you can speak spiritually into people's lives. it's really fun when you start to get creative and when you can share ideas back and forth. Because here's one more quick example, and then I'll take your question. So one time I was talking to a police officer, and he said, you know, it is so hard for me to talk about my faith in my office environment. He said, these are, you know, typically burly guys and all that, but very few Christians, and there's kind of a public feel to the place, and faith is kind of off limits. It's just something you just don't talk about too much. So here's what he does. Every time he goes on mission trips, he gets a whole bunch of photos printed out from his trip, and he plasters them all across the walls of his cubicle. And all these people come by and they're like, oh, what's that? Like those little kids, they look poor. Like, what was that? And what are they doing? They are asking, and now they're giving him permission to tell his story about a mission trip. And he weaves his faith testimony into the description of the trip. But they asked. And the thing about faith expression at work is this basic principle. It's permission-based. The case law in our country protects our ability to share our faith if we are sharing it because somebody asked about it. The issue is when we push our faith on people who didn't ask. That's called proselytizing. But this is another example. I never would have thought of that. But my point is, imagine if you create an entrepreneurial venture, a BIZNISTRY, where you bring your team together and everybody's brainstorming about creative ways that you can bring ministry to the people that you're serving with that enterprise. You had a question.
Well, the challenge is to communicate and get involved and to try to be Christ in someone's life, to speak life to them. But then there's so much technology limitations on, time is money, all of those things. And how do you do that now versus, like 10 years, 15 years ago, there wasn't as many, cell phones, relationships mattered, and now it's a whole different culture out there.
Yeah. First of all, it's really hard. And I agree with you. In some ways, it's harder than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And not just the technology and the transactional nature of work, but also faith hostility at work. That there's just, it used to be more spiritual indifference, but we're seeing a climate at work now where, if you're the baker who bakes wedding cakes and you choose not to bake one for a homosexual couple, and the next thing you know, you're being sued, you're being fined by the government, you're on national media, you're just like overwhelmed with this crushing force that says that you're discriminatory, right? So there are all these reasons why it's hard. As corny as this sounds, I have found that the best solution, at least for me, is one relationship at a time. So I look for ways to get to know the people that are in my sphere of influence so that I get beyond the technology and I get beyond the transactional nature. So let me give you an example. I was last month at my 30th reunion from Harvard University. It does not feel like it's been 30 years since I was a student there. If you do the math, I'm 52, and I really do not feel like I'm 52 years old. But be that as it may, I'm back there with all of my college peers who are having a midlife crisis, by the way. The number one reason that only 1/4 of my class came back was shame. They felt embarrassed that their adult lives had not lived up to the worth or quality of a Harvard education, and so they were embarrassed to come. But while I was there, I started getting these stories from some of my classmates, and none of them are Christians. And every time I would start to speak spiritually, at least in an explicit way, I could feel them pulling back. It's like, that's scary. But their lives are a mess and they're really hurting. And so I've been following up with them in customized ways, one at a time. Hey, how are you doing? Your daughter's on a suicide watch, or you talk to me about your life being like a water bug where you bounce off the surface but you never go deep in anything. I'm wondering if there's a way to challenge yourself next year where there's something deep that you start to do. In other words, I look for an entry point that's something that they have expressed as important to them, and I walk into that space with them. I go where they are rather than trying to bring them to where I am. And then when I get an open door, I walk through it and then I build on that relationship. And it takes a lot of time and patience. And sometimes you just don't know how far you're going to get. I'm very fond of my college roommate. And he shared with me last month, I think probably as a preventative statement, he said, "I'm a Jewish atheist." I think that was his way of telling me, don't go too far down any spiritual paths with me, Chuck, but I'm really glad to see you. So I need to start where he is, not where I am.
Thank you.
You bet. What about the rest of you? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Let's put a case scenario. Let's say I'm working for a non-faith-based company, and basically I'm dealing with making a decision that is not so ethical, like not unethical decision, but and it's totally legal. Let's put it this way. But I'm running the risk to lose my job or get punished if I don't get my job done. How one, as a Christian, deal with stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I lived through that once. I was working at LensCrafters, and we were doing a promotion event with what were then newly introduced flex hinges. For those of you who have eyeglasses where the arms on the side, you can bend them back and forth both ways and they kind of wiggle and stuff like that. And we had a brand that was really great from that standpoint. The hinges were very flexible, but we had a high failure rate. And they would fail after the warranty ended. So technically it was legal that if they broke at that point that the customer had to pay to get them replaced. But the life of these flex hinges was not really up to the standards that LensCrafters would typically set for durability. So I had to go forward to my management, and it was not an easy conversation because these were very profitable for us, and putting extra pressure on the supplier for these was uncomfortable. But I felt like it was the right thing to do. By the way, I was not a Christian at this point. I was spiritually seeking, but I still felt like there was an ethical issue here. And what I learned from it, a few things that I would share with you. Number one, if you bring the issue forward, not in a condemning way, but in a questioning way. So, hey, I'm noticing that we're having a high failure rate with this, or whatever the issue is, and I know that it's still within warranty, or I know that it technically or legally passes muster, but it doesn't seem like it feels right to me compared to the DNA of our company. What do you think? So instead of sort of forcing and telling, you're questioning, you're bringing it up, but you're asking it as a question. I'm wondering if we should be doing better here. It's a less threatening way to bring forward a real issue. Lots of times, by the time we bring forward hard issues like that, we bring it forward as a judgment. And when people receive that, they recoil. They're like, you've already judged me and we haven't had a discussion about this. They automatically become defensive, and it becomes much harder to have a conversation. So start with a question. Then second, my other suggestion would be walk through the situation with them as you're having conversation back and forth. Say, you know, I'm just thinking ahead. We know that this is a really popular product for us. Right now we're selling about 5,000 a week, but what if that grows within the next year the way we're projecting, and now we're looking at failure rates with 50,000 a week? At some point, it's likely that we're going to have a lot of customers who are going to start complaining, even though technically the warranty's void. They're going to be coming back to us nonetheless. So you start to walk into the situation and help them see through your eyes the ethical dimensions that they may have missed. Do not assume that they see the ethical conundrum that you do. Many times they don't. Now, this brings me to part number 3. Sometimes once you've done that, they may hear you and say, you know what, you're right. I hadn't looked at it that way, but this is an issue. So let's do X, Y, or Z. And then there's a change of course. Other times they'll say, you know, I know this is important to you. You brought it forward, duly noted, but I disagree with you. We're just going to move ahead. At that point, what you have to do is make a call as an individual working at that organization. Sometimes you look at it and say, this is not the way I would do it, but this person's my employer or my boss, you know, this is the decision the company's made, and while I personally disagree with it, I will agree to abide by what they've decided to do. Other times, you may say, I'm going to stand on principle. I'm going to quit my job, or I'm just going to leave because this isn't, if this is really the way we're going to do business, this isn't a place where I can be in business. And you have to make a personal judgment call at that point. I have found if you follow the steps I just described to you, about 80% of the time, most people will have a serious discussion with you about the issue, and they'll probably mitigate, maybe not as far as you want, but they'll probably make it better than it was so that you make some headway. 20% of the time, it doesn't work, and that's when you have to make a judgment call. Are you going to fall on a sword? And sometimes I think we should. Or do you decide to live with your employer's decision? The Bible does tell us to respect those in authority over us. And there's a limit, but that's the way I would approach it. You bet. That was a great question. That comes up a lot. Any other questions? All right, I have a question for you guys. How many of you are genuinely interested in starting an entrepreneurial venture of your own? So about half of you. I asked not because I'd say, hey, for the other half, why are you here? But I want to leave you guys today with a thought. And I'm just speaking from my own experience, but when I graduated from Harvard, I knew I wanted to go into business. And there was kind of a pre-programmed set of expectations about what that looked like. As graduates, we could pretty much route ourselves into one of three tracks. We could go into consulting, investment banking, or general management. And it was sort of understood that that's the trajectory. So figure out which one is most interesting to you, and then network like crazy so you can get as many job offers as possible, and then whatever the best one is, that's what you're going to take. And that's the way I approached the launch of my career. I did not, despite the fact that I had started up a company of my own in college and even one in high school before that, I didn't allow myself permission to consider that I might create a job for myself out of school from the beginning. I had in my mind that maybe someday I'll start an entrepreneurial venture after I've worked for a while in corporate America, stuff like that. But sometimes I wonder to myself in retrospect if I might have been able to jump into the entrepreneurial side of me sooner than I did. But I didn't even consider it seriously because it wasn't part of the standard track that we were programmed to walk as students graduating for business. And I just want to leave that with all of you. Some of you may be gifted as entrepreneurs and you don't even know that about yourself yet. Some of you may be sitting in here today because God wanted you to hear that before you leave. All righty then. I think we're good. Yes? Thank you all for coming.